So adding basic search functionality to an app isn't that troublesome with Ruby on Rails, but there is this concept of being a server-side rendered framework where getting that real-time search capabilities is kind of in the past anyway, been kind of a challenge. You'd either reach for some sort of crazy JavaScript solution or some front-end framework or some built-in gem that has it kind of just bundled. And there's no like de facto way, but with recent upgrades to the Rails framework, Rails 7 in particular ships with some nice hotwire enhanced functions and features. So if you check out hotwire.dev, there's kind of a suite of tools we can make use of to get the Rails ecosystem to be a little more like real time, a little more kind of responds like a single page app kind of scenario where you don't have to automatically reach for JavaScript. Like that's the main like calling for the reason to use like something like Turbo. Then there's Stimulus that's adding JavaScript, but it's convention based approach where it's minimal JavaScript you would ultimately add. But these things allow you to just speed up your development time, load way less JavaScript in the end, and just do things almost magically under the hood where you can, like the years before, it would take quite a bit to get going. So this guide's going to be about using Turbo in particular, Turbo frames and request types like that to build a real-time search engine. So just by basically creating some records, I've created some bands here as the demo app of the data that we're going to be searching. And as you can type, the results can come back in real time. You'll see that URL updating as well. So it's all just real-time stuff. And it's magic in that sense, but both the search functionality can work just by clicking the button, but you can type in real time and do that. So we're using a bit of Stimulus.js and then also just Turbo frames to render this stuff on the front end. And that's essentially what this guide's going to be about. So I'll walk you through it coming up. So why don't we kick things off by going and creating our new app. I'll do that now. In my tutorials directory, just CD in there, I'll do a Rails new, and I'll call this Turbocharged Search Demo. I already have one called Turbocharged Search, so I'm just foregoing that right now. And then I'm going to pass a few flags just for grins. This kind of stuff I do for just prototyping some apps. I'll typically reach for Tailwind, and then for JavaScript, ES build, just my preference. You don't need to do those flags, but it's what I'm going to do for this guide. So we'll install that. Following that, we'll generate the band model, and that's going to essentially be a scaffold. So once this is complete, I'll run that scaffold and migrate the database. Okay, so we'll CD into that app. It'll be Turbocharged Search Demo. You might just have like Turbocharged Search, up to you there. And then we've got our new app. If you want to boot it up, you can do that. I already have one running, but I'll do it here just for grins and close this tab. So our new bands resource doesn't exist yet, so you're going to get this default state that Rails gives you if you have nothing to the app yet, like no routing, no nothing. So we'll do a scaffold in this case. Generate scaffold. I'll call it band, and the name is going to be what we're end up searching. So I'll go ahead and create that. It's going to create pretty much everything we need under the hood besides tests. Since we skipped tests when we created the app, we're just going to skip the test framework for the demonstration purposes. You might not want to do that on your full-scale production style app. So then we can just go ahead and migrate. It creates that table. Now we're in the database, and again, we can boot up the server. It might be worthwhile rebooting after that. And that gives us, again, no big changes, but at this point we can update our code to have a new root path, which I'll make the bands index. So I will go to routes, just delete these right here, and I'll just say root. You can say to, or just root and say bands index. Saving that, refresh, you should get a new UI on localhost 3000, and it just got the bare minimum of UI in the app at this point. What I want to do is update our initial index here to be a searchable form. And right now, the way Rails scaffolds an app, it assumes the form's on a different page when you go to like new. If you go to bands new in particular, these are hard to see at the moment. It's just because Tailwind's reset is in place. But on the index, I'm going to add some more stuff here to kind of make it look a lot better. So underneath the H1, we'll add a form with. In here, instead of passing like an instance of the model, we can say a URL, and I'll say bands path. It's essentially going to go to a get request. So we'll say method get, because we want to return results, not post any or create any. And then coming up, we'll need this mechanism to call it turbo frame, and I'll explain this more coming up. But we'll say bands. And then we need a do block, so we can render a form label. Actually need an instance of form here. So then we have the label, and we could say query, we'll call it that. And you can give it a custom name, so search by band name. This will be what displays on the front end, but on the back, it'll know this is the query label. Class block margin bottom 2. Just to get some basic styles here. Form text field will be our search input. Again, this will be query. And I'll add some Tailwind classes. So px, py3, px4, rounded border, ring 0, focus ring 4, focus ring orange 100, focus shadow none, focus border orange 500, and then focus outline none. It's a lot of classes, but I want it to look decent. Okay, that gives us this input with these kind of styles at this point. On the layout, I'm going to add just some offset so we can keep it off the margins of the browser window. So container, MX, auto, maybe some margin on top and bottom. And maybe on the large screens, we'll do PX of 10, and on small screens 4. And contain that yield statement. There we go. Cool. And we'll soup up the other stuff here. Let's make the H1 class font bold, the text 3XL, margin bottom 3, just to give it kind of some hierarchy. And below here, I'm going to render what will be a bands partial. So we'll leave that alone for now. I'm going to have like a divider here. We'll render something in there. And then for the new button, we can add some styles real quick. Okay, it gives us some UI to work with. There's a space here. Don't worry about that at the moment. We're going to go back right now into the controller to get the logic in place. So we can do a makeshift query for when we do search terms. Really recommend probably extracting this to like a PG search gem or some sort of searchable gem that does things a lot better than this homegrown solution. But for the purposes of this example, it's going to make this easier for us. So we're going to get the parameter of query when we do submit this form. And it looks like I forgot the submit button. Let me go back and get that. We just say call it search, and I'll actually copy most of these classes. There we go. And maybe tweak it slightly. This will be 3. There we go. So that gives us the search button should we need it. It's not a big deal to have it. We can add a flex class here, and then space x3, give it some cushioning between each thing. There we go. Okay, now back in the controller where I was, we're going to get a query based on what gets submitted when you hit that submit button or that search button. This form is going to just go ahead and check basically if that's present. So in the present, if it is, we'll go ahead and render bands in a separate request, and it'll be band where name. We can use some SQL here is like. It's basically just trying to find something similar, and then we can annotate the params query and pass in the percent. And then we'll say else bands equals band.all. Okay, so with that in place, it's going to give us the request we're looking for. Why don't we go ahead and create some bands at this point? This should still work, but we don't have any bands to even search, so that's part of the problem. So we can do that with the console, Rails console, and I will create just some random ones. These are just going off some notes I had of random ones I came up with. Kind of a metalhead tool. I think that's spelled right. Could be wrong. And then we'll do each. Do band name. We could do this all in the console, which is cool. And from there, I will go and hit enter. It'll give me the next line. And this is just expecting some sort of additional action. So we could say band.create. And we'll use the name that we're looping through to create the bands. Then we'll hit enter again, and you can throw the end statement, and it should go ahead and loop through all those and create some new records. So now we have a few bands. We aren't rendering them, but we do have the bands. So we can go in our index, and I'll add what will be a new partial to the mix that's going to make this turbo thing work right. So we need one that's plural. And here we're going to render a turbo frame tag, bands, and then do. And then we'll render bands. And this is kind of confusing, but you'll see what I'm going to do on the index that will maybe make this more clear. I'm going to render that partial now. We'll pass in the instance of bands. So this is coming back from the controller in this case. So we'll get bands, and then we'll go into that partial. We have that instance of the local variable, which is right here. And we're able to loop through it essentially, just the way the magic of Rails works with the conventions it's got. So now we get this turbo frame tag that's wrapped around this entire partial. And we need it around everything because we want to re-render this list each time a new search is performed coming up. So the way that's going to work is just replacing that list, so to speak. So why don't we address the UI real quick of this. I will get rid of this label and add a linked. And we can actually wrap it in a p tag. Band path is band, and then class will be text orange 600 underline hover text orange 700. And that'll give us just this mix of UI to work with, and then we could say text large and then letting loose to add some space between them. There we go. Okay, that gives us our list now. It's got that offset, so there's some space in between. It's not looking completely awesome, but it works okay. The next thing is it doesn't know to respond to our turbo request at this point. We did add this thing, like I mentioned before, in our form that's going to have this turbo frame tag associated with it, and that's going to be some sort of indicator from the Rails side and the Turbo Rails gem to indicate that this should expect that request, that we've added it to the form. But doing that, we need still some instructions in the controller, so to speak. So right now this will return like just HTML response just by native default. So you could search for a term and just have like part of it. It'll go ahead and return it, but nothing really passes. If we go into the console, maybe you'll see it better. It does a basic get query. It's just index as HTML at this point, but we kind of want it to be the real-time search of Turbo. So we can actually query for that in the controller using a built-in helper method called turbo frame request. And this comes to us from the gem. If we go to gem file, and there's going to be a Turbo Rails gem here that's bundled with that one. So this we get for free. It might make sense to extract this as like a global helper in your application controller, where you can just respond to any request in such a way. But for our purposes, I'll do this just to make it extra clear. So you'd say render the certain partial in this case. Bands, and that's the one we just created. And then we'll say locals, bands. So essentially we're going to re-render this partial each time this response is generated right here. And that's how it's going to know about it. It's going to know about it because we've got a turbo frame wrapped around this rendering statement. So if you look at the source code, you'll see a turbo frame around that. It's got the ID of bands thanks to the built-in little helper method here. You could add just a div that's a turbo frame tag or a turbo frame just like this. ID of bands if you want to do it that way, and it would work all the same. This Rails way just extracts this to a little helper method like that. Okay, so that's part of the problem solved. And now if we click Aerosmith, it's still going to perform the search. You notice it created an event here when we did that. It's just doing some stuff under the hood that's part of the Turbo framework. And that's, again, because we added that data attribute to the form and also that response cycle that's coming back. I think I forgot one bit of info here. We need else render index. Okay, so now I can check if this is present. If we go Metallica, it's part of it. So what we want to do next is update the HTML, the URL that comes back right now, the URL I mean. So if we could get that into the form, we can additionally add that constraint. So we could say turbo action advance. So we say Aerosmith. Now that query comes within the URL each time we commit that. So that's nice. And then when you update it, it updates in the URL as well. So that's you can almost copy and paste this to someone else and they'll be able to have that same search already present. That's kind of a nice addition. Now we want to do it in real time. Right now I don't want to click search to render all the basic defaults here. And I want to like clear things out as we go through. So what we can do is add a bit of stimulus.js to respond to this cycle. A way it's going to work is just kind of hijack that search form and listen to an input event, and then we'll be able to do a few things on the fly. So a quick way to add this, and if you create the app in a Rails 7 app, you should have stimulus by default, depending on which JavaScript ecosystem you use. ESBuild should get it all the same as anything else. So we can actually generate a stimulus controller on the command line. And I'll say generate stimulus, and I'll say search form. So create a new file called search form controller in our JavaScript controllers folder, and it updates the manifest, which essentially is a application controller index file that just registers the new import of that search form file, and then registers it as a controller for the stimulus framework. So it's kind of some technical details there, but if you do that from the command line, it just does it automatically, which is nice. So now we have this in our arsenal. I'm going to add one called search here, and we'll come back to this. I'm going to go back to the index and set things up. We have two data properties here already, but I want to add another that's going to signify that this is where we're going to work with that stimulus controller. So we'll go into that and add a data controller, and we'll call it search form. And then inside that, we need to go and hijack essentially the text field. So we can say data action. The action is going to be a signifier of some sort of a JavaScript event. So it could be a click event, could be a submit event, an input event, key up event, all those JavaScript events. In our case, we're going to use input. And then we'll call that search form controller and then the search function on it. So you need to go in that order and use those conventions when you're doing this type of action on a form. So now when we fire this and we type some sort of input, this should fire some sort of event. Right now it's not doing anything, but if we want to just console.log something out to verify, go back here, index, looks like nothing's happening there. Let's see. I need to spell controller right in the data attribute there. So if we do that now, there we go. Now we get some events. They're firing each time we're input. So you'll see this counter going up in my console, which is good. That means we're getting somewhere. Now what I want to do here in this function is essentially a looping mechanism with JavaScript, which is a little gross, but if there's a built-in clear timeout function, and we'll pass this .timeout. It's essentially this is going to be the event that's coming through. And then we'll say this .timeout and set it here equals this. Then we'll set timeout. This is another built-in JavaScript function where you can kind of delay the response of something or clear it after a certain period of time. So this .element refers to the form that we've added the controller to, because basically whatever the controller is placed on is going to be this .element in this context. It's a little confusing until you're working with stimulus more, but that's how that works. You can say request.submit. So we're submitting the form essentially as each event occurs. So essentially there's an automatic event coming through here since we're targeting this action as an event, and we get that for free. So we're able to kind of get that, and then for each event that fires, we'll call this clear this.timeout, which essentially is being set here on this class. And then that's using its own set timeout function to just go ahead and submit. So just essentially what we're doing is each key command we're searching for something and going forth with it. So right now it looks like I need to reload the page. Yeah, so now I get the free, as you type, the list updates, the query updates in the URL as well. So that's a cool little bonus. And we get our real-time capabilities. So that's essentially the very, very primitive solution to real-time search. You could go for miles and make this better by including better UI or using a better gem to get a better query than this. This is just very, example purposes only. You can find a lot more details of like the PG search gem that's going to be way cooler to use. Let's do Google. There's a whole gem dedicated to search essentially, and there's I could probably do a tutorial on this, how to install it and configure it. But you could go very deep with searching capabilities here, search against different models, combine models, etc., using different attributes on the columns of the database. So like I said, I'd improve that. You can also think about extracting this into its own kind of request cycle. It might look like something in your application controller where you just respond to certain requests a certain way and Rails just automatically picks it up. But in this case, it's being more explicit. It's just kind of junky looking, to be completely honest. So up to you. I don't know that you'll add multiple searches everywhere in your app, but this might be something you could extract and clean up quite a bit. And then you maybe consider turbo streams here. So as you update, you could just either replace this field with a turbo stream response here, or just use this built-in turbo frame request and go to town. It's up to you if you want to use turbo frames or streams here or combine them, up to you. But there's quite a few ways to go about it. I'd say this is kind of an older way to go about it. You could use streams here to update them in real time. So hopefully that was helpful. I know that some of this stuff is brand new, kind of fuzzy. It's still a little unclear to me, but I'm learning, so I'm trying to get the hang of it. And this is me doing that in the public. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or feedback, let me know. I hope to explore more of this stuff in the future. All right, peace.